The frozen Montana morning air cut through William Whitehorse's lungs as he pushed open the garage door, expecting to find 3 dying raccoons he'd rescued from the worst blizzard in 50 years. What he discovered instead made his blood run cold. The tools weren't where he'd left them. Every wrench, every screwdriver, every piece of equipment had been arranged in perfect military formation, organized by size and function with surgical precision. No wild animal could have done this. No animal at all. The mother raccoon sat motionless in the corner, her dark eyes fixed on him with an intelligence that made his hands shake. Around her neck, barely visible beneath matted fur, was a thin leather collar he hadn't noticed in last night's desperate rescue. As he leaned closer, his heart hammered against his ribs. Engraved on the tiny metal tag were letters that would change everything he thought he knew about family, loss, and the granddaughter he'd believed was dead. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. William Bill Whitehorse had never imagined his life would come to this. Standing alone in a kitchen that still smelled like his wife's morning coffee, 6 months after Sarah's funeral. At 68, the Cherokee American veteran had survived Vietnam, raised a son, and built a cattle ranch that had fed his family for 4 generations. Now, with arthritic hands wrapped around a cold mug, he counted the pills that could end it all. The 400-acre spread outside Billings stretched white and barren beyond frost-covered windows. What had once been his pride, rolling pastures dotted with Angus cattle, now stood empty, sold off piece by piece to pay for Sarah's cancer treatments. The medical bills had devoured their savings like wildfire, leaving behind a mountain of debt that towered over his monthly veteran's pension of $1,400. Sarah had been his anchor for 43 years, the steady voice that talked him through nightmares about Saigon, and the gentle hands that coaxed him back from the dark places his mind wandered. When the cancer took her, it took his will to fight. Their son, Marcus, killed by an IED in Afghanistan 2 years earlier, had left behind a daughter, Emma, but grief and stubborn pride had built walls between grandfather and granddaughter that now seemed insurmountable. The foreclosure notice lay spread across the oak table Sarah had inherited from her grandmother. 3 months behind on payments, with the bank's final warning stamped in red ink. December 22nd. 5 days away. 5 days to lose everything his great-grandfather had carved from Montana wilderness with nothing but determination and calloused hands. Dr. James Morningstar, his old Army buddy turned local veterinarian, had been calling daily since Sarah's funeral. So had Mrs. Ruth Lightfoot, the 72-year-old Crow Nation elder who lived on the neighboring property. Both understood the signs, the unopened mail piling up, the whiskey bottles accumulating in the trash, the way Bill avoided town, and the pitying looks of people who'd known him since childhood. Outside, the wind howled with a fury that rattled windows and sent snow spiraling like ghosts across the empty pastures. The Weather Service had issued warnings about an unprecedented storm system moving down from Canada, the kind of blizzard that could bury a man's mistakes along with his memories. Bill's weathered fingers traced the edge of Marcus's final letter from Afghanistan, the paper soft from handling. "Take care of Emma for me, Dad. She's all the family we have left." But pride and pain had kept him from reaching out, and now Emma was somewhere in the world, probably believing her grandfather didn't care enough to call. The pills rattled in their amber bottle as his hand trembled. Outside, the storm was building, and inside, the walls of the ranch house that had sheltered 4 generations of Whitehorses felt like they were closing in. By Christmas, strangers would own this land, and Bill Whitehorse would be just another broken-down veteran with nowhere left to run. The wind screamed louder, as if the storm itself knew what he was contemplating, The storm hit with a vengeance that reminded Bill of artillery barrages in Vietnam, relentless, deafening, and utterly without mercy. By 8:30 that evening, the wind was howling at 70 miles per hour, driving snow so thick it turned the world beyond his windows into a white void. The temperature had plummeted to 35 below zero, and the weather radio crackled with warnings that made even seasoned Montanans nervous. Bill moved through his evening routine with military precision, checking the backup generator, securing loose items around the property, and making sure his emergency supplies were accessible. The power had already flickered twice, and he knew it was only a matter of time before the lines came down. In weather like this, a man could die within minutes of stepping outside unprepared. He was banking the fire in the living room when he heard it, a sound that cut through the storm's fury like a knife through canvas. Scratching. Persistent, desperate scratching at the garage door, accompanied by something that sounded almost like crying. His first instinct was to ignore it. Animals got confused in blizzards, and he'd learned long ago that interfering with wildlife usually ended badly for everyone involved. But the sound continued, growing more frantic. Whatever was out there wasn't giving up. Bill grabbed his heavy coat and the military-grade flashlight that had seen him through 2 decades of service. The cold hit him like a physical blow as he stepped onto the covered porch, the wind trying to tear the door from his hands. The garage stood separate from the house, connected by a covered walkway that Sarah had insisted on after too many trips through Montana winters carrying groceries. As Bill approached, his flashlight beam cut through the swirling snow, and what he saw made him stop dead in his tracks. 3 dark shapes huddled against the garage door, barely visible against the white fury of the storm. The largest was clearly an adult raccoon, her thick winter coat matted with ice and snow. Pressed against her sides were 2 smaller forms, young ones, maybe 6 months old, their tiny bodies shaking violently from the cold. But it was the third kit that made Bill's breath catch in his throat. The smallest raccoon lay motionless in the snow, its breathing so shallow it was barely perceptible. The mother had positioned herself over the dying kit, trying to shield it with her body while keeping the other 2 close. Her dark eyes, reflecting Bill's flashlight beam, held an intelligence and desperation that struck him like a punch to the gut. This wasn't normal behavior. Raccoons should have been denned up for the winter, safe in hollow trees or abandoned buildings. Something had driven this family out into conditions that would kill them within hours. The mother's left front paw was clearly injured, hanging at an odd angle that suggested a break or severe sprain. She couldn't forage, couldn't provide for her young, and now the storm was finishing what hunger had started. Bill stood frozen, his military training warring with something deeper. A paternal instinct that Sarah had always said was his greatest strength and his most dangerous weakness. Every survival manual ever written said to leave wild animals alone, especially predators. Raccoons could carry rabies, could attack without warning, could cause more problems than any man should willingly take on. But the smallest kit wheezed with each breath, and the mother's eyes never left his face. In that gaze, Bill saw something he recognized from his own mirror. The desperate love of a parent watching their child slip away, powerless to stop it. The wind gusted harder, and snow began to pile against the garage door where the Raccoon family had taken shelter. In another hour, maybe less, they would be buried completely. The mother tried to drag her dying kit closer to the door, but her injured paw made movement agonizing. She let out a sound, half growl, half whimper, that carried such raw anguish it made Bill's chest tighten. He thought of Marcus, bleeding out on a dusty road half a world away while medics fought to save him. He thought of Sarah, wasting away in a hospital bed while machines beeped out the rhythm of her failing heart. He thought of all the times he'd been powerless to protect the people he loved most. But this time was different. This time, he could do something. The garage was insulated and had an old space heater that still worked. It wouldn't be warm, but it would be above freezing. He could spread out some old blankets, provide shelter until the storm passed. It was crazy, dangerous, probably illegal, and definitely not what a rational man would do. Bill unlocked the garage door and pushed it up just far enough to create an opening. Warm air spilled out into the frigid night, and the mother raccoon's head lifted immediately. She could smell the relative warmth, could sense the possibility of salvation for her young. Moving slowly, speaking in the low, calm voice he'd once used to gentle, frightened horses, Bill began clearing a path through the snow. "Easy now," he murmured, though he knew the words meant nothing to the animals. "Nobody's going to hurt you here." The mother raccoon watched his every movement, her body tense with the conflict between desperation and instinct. Trust a human or watch her babies die. It wasn't much of a choice, but it was the only one she had. Bill spread an old sleeping bag near the heater and turned the temperature up as high as it would go. The garage filled with the sound of warming air, and for the first time since the storm began, the howling wind seemed less threatening. When he turned back to the raccoon family, the mother had made her decision. With infinite care, she began to move her kits toward the open door, dragging the unconscious one with her teeth while the two stronger babies followed on unsteady legs. It took 20 minutes of painstaking effort, but finally, all 4 raccoons were inside the garage. Bill lowered the door behind them and stood back, his heart pounding. He'd just committed himself to caring for a family of wild animals in the middle of the worst blizzard Montana had seen in decades. If they died, he'd carry that guilt to his grave. If they lived, he'd have to figure out what came next. The mother raccoon arranged her kits on the sleeping bag, her injured paw making every movement painful. But her eyes, when they met Bill's again, held something that might have been gratitude, or maybe that was just an old man's wishful thinking. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the garage, 3 raccoon kits began to stir as warmth slowly returned to their small bodies. Bill settled into a folding chair to keep watch, unaware that he'd just made the most important decision of his life. Bill woke to silence, the kind of deep, muffled quiet that only comes after a blizzard has spent its fury. Pale morning light filtered through the garage's single window, and for a moment he couldn't remember why he was sleeping in a folding chair with a crick in his neck that felt like someone had driven railroad spikes between his vertebrae. Then he saw them. The raccoon family had survived the night, but what stopped Bill cold wasn't their survival. It was what the mother had done while he slept. Every tool in his garage had been moved. Not scattered or knocked over, but deliberately arranged in perfect rows according to size and function. Wrenches lined up from smallest to largest, screwdrivers sorted by type, socket sets organized with military precision. It was impossible. Wild animals didn't understand human organizational systems. Yet there it was, his entire workshop arranged with the same attention to detail that drill sergeants had beaten into him 40 years ago. The mother raccoon sat in the corner, watching him with those unnervingly intelligent dark eyes, as if waiting for his approval of her work. "What in the hell?" Bill whispered, running arthritic fingers through his gray hair. His voice seemed too loud in the quiet garage, and the 2 healthy kits looked up from where they'd been exploring a cardboard box. The smallest one, the one he'd been sure wouldn't make it through the night, lay curled against its mother's side, breathing steadily, but still desperately weak. That's when he noticed the collar. It was thin leather, nearly hidden beneath the mother's thick winter fur, with a small metal tag that caught the morning light. Bill's hands shook as he moved closer, speaking in the same low voice he'd used the night before. "Easy, girl. Let me just—" The raccoon didn't flee or show aggression. Instead, she tilted her head, allowing him to examine the collar more closely. The leather was worn but well made, and the metal tag bore letters that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. Penny. Penny. Emma's childhood nickname. The name hit him like shrapnel, bringing with it a flood of memories he'd tried to bury, along with his grief. Emma, at age 5, giggling as she fed raccoons that raided Sarah's garden. Emma, at 12, nursing an injured owl back to health despite Bill's protests about wild animals. Emma, at 18, fighting with him about her choice to study wildlife biology instead of something practical. And Emma, at 23, standing in this very garage after Marcus's funeral, tears streaming down her face as she begged her grandfather to let her help him through his grief. "I'm all the family you have left, Grandpa," she'd said. "Don't shut me out." But he had shut her out. Pride and pain had built walls between them, and now... The space heater chose that moment to sputter and die, bringing Bill back to the present with a jolt. The temperature in the garage was already beginning to drop, and the smallest kit, the one he was already thinking of as Hope, stirred restlessly in her mother's fur. He needed to get them somewhere warmer, but moving wild animals into his house crossed a line that even his addled brain recognized as dangerous. The sound of an approaching vehicle cut through his internal debate. Through the window he could see Ruth Lightfoot's ancient Chevy pickup grinding its way up his snow-packed drive. The engine wheezed and protested, but the old truck had seen worse storms than this one. Ruth climbed out wearing traditional winter gear, thick buffalo hide coat, wool-lined boots that had probably walked more Montana miles than most vehicles. At 72, the Crow elder moved with the careful dignity of someone who'd learned to respect winter's power, but refused to be intimidated by it. "Billy Whitehorse," she called, using the name no one but Sarah had dared to use in 20 years. "You better not be dead in there, because I didn't drive 5 miles through snowdrifts to find a frozen corpse." Bill opened the garage door, and Ruth's sharp eyes immediately took in the scene, the organized tools, the Raccoon family, and the haunted expression on his face. She didn't seem surprised by any of it, which somehow made everything more unsettling. "Found some visitors, did you?" she said, stepping into the garage and studying the raccoons with professional interest. "Mother's got a broken paw, looks like. Little one there won't last long without proper heat. Ruth, this collar..." Bill's voice cracked like a teenager's. "It says Penny." That was Emma's name when she was little. The old woman's expression didn't change, but something shifted in her dark eyes. She approached the mother raccoon slowly, speaking in crow language, low, melodic sounds that seemed to calm the animal immediately. When she reached out to examine the collar more closely, the raccoon not only allowed it but leaned into her touch. "This isn't a wild animal, Billy," Ruth said quietly. "This is somebody's pet, somebody who cared enough to give her a name and a collar." She paused, studying his face. "When's the last time you talked to your granddaughter?" The question hit harder than the Montana wind. 2 years, not since Marcus's funeral." The admission tasted like ashes in his mouth. Things were said. Pride, you know, stupid, stubborn pride. "Pride's a cold companion on a winter night," Ruth observed, scratching behind Penny's ears with a gentleness that belied her weathered hands. "Especially when family's all you got left." A new sound interrupted their conversation, the distinctive rumble of Sheriff Tom Eagleheart's patrol vehicle. Through the window, Bill could see the sheriff's SUV pulling up behind Ruth's truck, emergency lights cutting through the gray morning like warning flares. Tom climbed out, his expression grim beneath the brim of his departmental Stetson. At 55, the sheriff carried himself with the kind of authority that came from 20 years of dealing with everything from drunk ranchers to drug dealers using reservation land as a highway. He was also Marcus's best friend from high school, which complicated things in ways Bill didn't want to think about. "Bill," Tom said, nodding respectfully as he approached. "Ruth called me this morning. Said you might need some help with wildlife issues." The emphasis on wildlife suggested this visit was about more than raccoons in a garage. Bill felt his defenses rising, the same stubborn pride that had cost him his relationship with Emma threatening to make everything worse. "No laws against giving shelter to animals during a storm," he said, crossing his arms despite the cold air flowing through the open door. "No, there aren't," Tom agreed. "But I got some news you need to hear. About Emma." The words hung in the air like icicles ready to fall. Bill's heart hammered against his ribs as possibilities raced through his mind, none of them good. People didn't get official visits from the sheriff about relatives who were safe and sound. "What kind of news?" Bill's voice came out as barely more than a whisper. Tom glanced at Ruth, who nodded almost imperceptibly. "Her backpack was found 3 days ago down by the Stillwater River, about 200 miles north of here, near the Crow Reservation boundary." "Found by who?" Bill asked, though part of him didn't want to know the answer. "Fishermen checking ice thickness for next season. Backpack was caught in some deadfall, looked like it had been there a while." Tom's professional mask slipped slightly, revealing the grief of a man who'd lost too many young people to Montana's unforgiving landscape. "Bill, Emma's been missing for 18 months. We've had search parties, helicopters, everything. I'm sorry, but we all assumed—" The garage suddenly felt too small, the walls pressing in like the sides of a coffin. Emma missing for 18 months, and he'd never even known. While he'd been nursing his pride and his pain, his granddaughter had been lost somewhere in the Montana wilderness. Hope chose that moment to emit a weak, mewling cry that cut through the morning air like a knife. Penny immediately nuzzled her smallest kit, making soft, chittering sounds that seemed designed to comfort. The sight of that desperate maternal care, so similar to what Sarah had shown Marcus, what Bill should have shown Emma, broke something loose in his chest. "She's alive," he said suddenly, the words coming from someplace deeper than logic. "If these raccoons belong to Emma, and they're here now, she sent them. Somehow she sent them home." Tom and Ruth exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their opinion of grief-addled old men grasping at impossible straws. But Bill didn't care what they thought. He'd spent 2 years drowning in regret and whiskey, preparing to give up entirely. Now, for the first time since Sarah's funeral, he had something that might be hope. "I'm keeping them," he announced, his voice gaining strength with each word. "These raccoons, this collar, they're telling us something. Emma's still out there, and I'm going to find her." The storm had passed, but Bill Whitehorse was just beginning to understand that the real battle was yet to come. The kitchen of the Whitehorse Ranch House hadn't seen this much activity since Sarah's funeral reception 6 months ago. Bill had transformed the space into a makeshift animal hospital, using skills he hadn't called upon since his Army veterinary days. Penny and her 2 healthy kits explored their new surroundings with typical raccoon curiosity. But Hope lay motionless on a heating pad, her breathing shallow and labored. Dr. James Morningstar arrived within an hour of Ruth's phone call, his veterinary bag in one hand and a portable oxygen concentrator in the other. At 45, James still carried himself with the military bearing that had made him an excellent field medic in Iraq, but his dark eyes held the compassion that made him an even better veterinarian. "Jesus, Bill," he muttered, kneeling beside the makeshift ICU they'd created on the kitchen table. "This little one's in rough shape. Hypothermia, probable pneumonia, and she's severely underweight." His hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking vital signs and assessing the kit's condition. "How long has she been like this?" "Found them last night during the storm," Bill replied, watching anxiously as James examined Hope. "The mother's got a broken paw, can't forage properly. They were all half dead when I brought them in." James's expression grew more concerned as he listened to Hope's lungs with a stethoscope. "This is serious, Bill. I can treat her here for now, but if she doesn't improve in the next 24 hours, she'll need intensive care that I can't provide in a kitchen." Ruth stood by the window, watching the interaction between Penny and the other kits. The mother raccoon had claimed a corner near the warm stove, but her eyes never left the humans working on her smallest baby. "She knows," Ruth said quietly. "The mother knows you're trying to help." "How can you tell?" Bill asked, grateful for any distraction from the medical drama unfolding on his kitchen table. "Body language. A wild raccoon would be fighting us, trying to protect her young from predators. But look at her. She's anxious, yes, but not aggressive. This animal has lived with humans before." Ruth moved closer to examine Penny's collar again. "This leather work is Cherokee, Billy. See these patterns? My grandmother taught me to recognize the traditional designs." The revelation hit Bill like a physical blow. Emma had always been fascinated by her Cherokee heritage, spending summers on the reservation learning traditional crafts from elders like Ruth. If she'd made the collar herself, it meant she'd been preparing for something, planning to live off the grid with animals as companions. James finished his examination and began setting up an IV line for Hope. "She's stable for now, but barely. The pneumonia is advanced and her blood sugar is dangerously low. I'm going to start her on antibiotics and glucose, but—" He trailed off, the unspoken words hanging heavy in the warm kitchen air. "But what?" Bill demanded, his voice sharper than he'd intended. "But she might not make it, Bill. I've seen hypothermia cases like this before. Sometimes the damage is too extensive to reverse, especially in animals this young." The word sent Bill spiraling back to another kitchen, another desperate medical crisis. Marcus, at age 7, burning with fever from pneumonia, while Bill and Sarah took turns holding ice packs against their son's forehead and praying to whatever God might be listening. They'd saved Marcus then, only to lose him 20 years later to a roadside bomb in a country most Americans couldn't find on a map. "No," Bill said firmly, surprising everyone in the room, including himself. "She's going to make it. I didn't pull this family out of a blizzard just to watch them die in my kitchen." Ruth smiled, the first genuine smile Bill had seen from her in months. "There's the Billy Whitehorse I remember, the one who never gave up on anything worth fighting for." Tom Eaglehart returned that afternoon with news that complicated everything. He spread a topographical map across the kitchen table, careful to avoid the medical equipment surrounding Hope's makeshift ICU. "The backpack was found here," he said, pointing to a spot along the Stillwater River. "But there's something else. The fisherman who found it said there were signs of a camp nearby. Recent signs." Bill leaned over the map, his pulse quickening. "How recent?" "Within the last few weeks, maybe even days. Someone's been living rough up there and they know what they're doing. Proper shelter, good camouflage, evidence of hunting and foraging." Tom's finger traced along the river. "The thing is, this area is almost impossible to reach by vehicle, especially this time of year. Whoever's up there went in on foot and planned to stay." "That's Emma," Bill said with absolute certainty. "She always talked about living off the grid, studying animal behavior in their natural habitat. And if these raccoons found their way from there to here, that's over 200 miles through some of the roughest country in Montana," Tom pointed out. "In winter conditions, with an injured animal and 3 kits, it's not impossible, but it would take weeks." Ruth studied the map with the intensity of someone who'd spent decades reading the land like a book. "Unless they had help," she said slowly. "Look at the route. It follows old migration paths, places where animals know to find food and shelter." "If Emma trained these raccoons, taught them to navigate—" "You're talking about an 18-month survival situation," James interrupted, looking up from where he was adjusting Hope's IV drip. A young woman living alone in the Montana wilderness through one of the harshest winters on record? The odds are, the odds don't matter, Bill cut him off. What matters is that she's alive and she needs help. These raccoons didn't walk 200 miles through a blizzard by accident. They came here for a reason. As if summoned by his words, Penny approached the kitchen table where Hope lay connected to medical equipment. The mother raccoon rose on her hind legs, placing her good paw gently against the edge of the table. Her dark eyes moved from her unconscious kit to Bill's face, and the intelligence in that gaze was unmistakable. "She's asking you to save her baby," Ruth said softly. "Just like you asked the doctors to save Marcus, like you asked God to save Sarah." Sometimes the asking is all we can do. The phone rang, cutting through the emotional tension like a buzzsaw. Tom answered on the second ring, his expression growing increasingly grim as he listened to the voice on the other end. "That was the State Wildlife Office," he said after hanging up. "They got word about your raccoon situation, probably from one of the EMTs who heard the radio chatter. They're sending someone out tomorrow to assess the situation." "What does that mean?" Bill demanded, though he suspected he already knew. "It means they want to confiscate the animals. Raccoons can carry rabies, and there are strict protocols about wild animals in domestic settings. They're talking about quarantine procedures, maybe euthanization for testing." The kitchen erupted in angry voices as everyone spoke at once, but Bill heard none of it. His attention was focused entirely on Penny, who had somehow understood the threatening tone of Tom's words. The mother raccoon had positioned herself between the humans and her kits, her body language shifting from trusting to protective in the space of a heartbeat. "Over my dead body," Bill said quietly, and the room fell silent. "These animals aren't going anywhere. They're the only connection I have to Emma, and I'll be damned if I'm going to let some bureaucrat in a government truck take them away." "Bill, you need to think about this rationally," James warned. "If you resist, they can bring in federal wildlife agents. You could face serious charges, imprisonment, heavy fines. Is it worth risking everything for animals you've known for less than 24 hours? But Bill was already moving, gathering supplies from his emergency kit with the efficiency of a man who'd spent decades preparing for the worst. "Ruth, can you take the healthy kits to your place?" "Tom, I need you to buy me some time with the wildlife people. Tell them the roads are still impassable or something." "What are you planning?" Ruth asked, though her tone suggested she already knew. "I'm going north to find Emma, and I'm taking Penny with me." Bill loaded medical supplies into a backpack, his movements sharp and decisive. "If she trained these raccoons to find their way home, then she can guide me back to where she's hiding." "Bill, that's insane," Tom protested. "You're 68 years old, you haven't done serious wilderness camping in decades, and you're talking about tracking someone through country that's already claimed dozens of experienced hikers." "Then come with me," Bill challenged, turning to face his old friend. "You knew Marcus better than anyone except me. Don't you owe it to his memory to find his daughter?" The sheriff's weathered face went through a series of emotions, duty warring with friendship, protocol battling loyalty. Finally, he sighed and reached for his radio. "I'm going to regret this, but I'll call in sick for a few days. Give us a head start before the wildlife people show up." Hope chose that moment to stir on her heating pad, making a soft mewing sound that brought Penny immediately to attention. The kit's eyes opened for the first time since the rescue, focusing with obvious effort on her mother's face. It wasn't much, but it was progress. "She's fighting," James said with genuine amazement. "Her vitals are actually improving. Maybe there's more hope here than I thought." Bill knelt beside the table, placing his weathered hand near Hope's tiny paw. The kit's eyes shifted to his face, and for just a moment he could have sworn he saw recognition there. Not of him specifically, but of safety, of someone who cared enough to fight for her life. "Hold on, little one," he whispered. "We're going to find your family." All of them. Outside, the Montana wind carried the promise of another storm, but inside the warm kitchen, something that had been broken for a very long time was slowly beginning to heal. The descent into the river canyon began at 4 in the morning, when darkness still cloaked their movements and the temperature hovered at 20 below zero. Bill had packed like a man preparing for war, emergency medical supplies, military-grade cold weather gear, and enough provisions for a week in the wilderness. Penny rode in a specially modified carrier strapped to his chest, her dark eyes alert and watchful as they navigated the treacherous terrain. Tom had insisted on coming despite his initial protests, bringing his own survival gear and the kind of tactical equipment that came with 20 years of law enforcement. Ruth had stayed behind to care for Hope and the other kits, but not before performing a traditional blessing that involved burning sage and speaking words in Crow that made the hair on Bill's arms stand up. "The ancestors will guide your path," she'd said, pressing a small leather pouch into his hand. "But remember, sometimes the thing we're searching for isn't what we expect to find." Now, 3 hours into their trek through country that seemed designed to kill the unwary, Bill was beginning to understand what she meant. The landscape was beautiful in the way that only Montana wilderness could be. Vast, unforgiving, and utterly indifferent to human survival. Snow-covered peaks stretched endlessly in every direction, and the silence was so complete it felt like the world had been wrapped in cotton. But there were signs, if you knew how to read them. Penny had grown increasingly agitated as they'd moved north, chittering softly and pointing with her good paw toward specific landmarks. She was following a route that made no sense to human logic, but perfect sense to an animal mind. A path that avoided the most obvious dangers while staying close to water and natural shelter. "She knows where she's going," Bill said, adjusting the carrier straps as they paused to rest beside a frozen stream. "Look at her body language. She's not exploring, she's navigating." Tom studied the tracks they'd been following for the past hour, a mix of animal prints and the occasional boot tread that suggested human passage. "These are at least 2 weeks old, maybe more. If Emma was here, she's moved on by now." "Or something moved her," Bill replied grimly, examining what looked like drag marks in the snow near the water's edge. "These tracks tell a story, Tom. Question is whether we're going to like the ending." They pushed deeper into the canyon, following a game trail that wound between towering pine trees and rocky outcroppings that provided natural windbreaks. The air was thin enough to make breathing difficult, and Bill could feel his age in every step. His knees protested against the steep descents, and his back ached from the weight of the pack, but Penny's increasing excitement kept him moving forward. It was past noon when they found the first real evidence of human habitation, a carefully concealed lean-to shelter built against a rock face and camouflaged with natural materials. The construction was expert level, using traditional wilderness survival techniques that spoke of extensive training and experience. "Military style," Tom observed, examining the knotwork that held the shelter together. "Whoever built this knew what they were doing. This could keep someone alive through a Montana winter if they had enough supplies." Bill was studying the fire pit when Penny suddenly became agitated, chittering loudly and struggling against the carrier's restraints. Her good paw pointed insistently toward a stand of aspens about 50 yards away, and her vocalizations took on an urgent quality that made both men reach for their sidearms. "Easy, girl," Bill murmured, but his own instincts were screaming danger. Something was wrong with the landscape ahead. Too quiet, too still, as if even the wildlife was avoiding the area. They approached the aspen grove with tactical caution, Tom taking point while Bill followed with Penny providing what could only be described as excited commentary. The trees were young and closely spaced, their white bark showing the claw marks of bears and the gnawing damage of porcupines. But it was what lay beyond the trees that made Bill's blood run cold. A second shelter, larger and more permanent than the first, had been built into a natural depression in the rocky hillside, but this one showed signs of violence. torn fabric, scattered supplies, and dark stains in the snow that could only be blood. Whatever had happened here, it hadn't been peaceful. "Jesus Christ," Tom whispered, drawing his service weapon as they approached the destroyed camp. "Bill, we need to call this in. This is a crime scene." But Bill was already moving forward, drawn by Penny's increasingly frantic calls toward what remained of the shelter. Inside, partially buried under torn canvas and broken supplies, he found Emma's research journal, a thick notebook filled with meticulous observations about animal behavior, weather patterns, and survival techniques. The final entries were dated 3 weeks ago, and the handwriting grew increasingly erratic as the pages progressed. Emma had been tracking something, or someone, that was hunting in her territory. She'd documented evidence of poaching, illegal trapping, and what she described as systematic destruction of wildlife habitat for unknown purposes. "She was investigating something," Bill said, passing the journal to Tom while Penny continued her agitated chittering. "Look at these notes. She wasn't just surviving out here, she was gathering evidence." Tom flipped through the pages, his expression growing darker with each entry. Poaching operations, illegal mining surveys, mentions of armed men in the area. "Bill, your granddaughter stumbled into something dangerous, and whoever was behind it knew she was watching them." A gunshot echoed across the canyon, the sound bouncing off rock walls and seeming to come from everywhere at once. Both men dropped instinctively, Tom scanning the surrounding ridgelines while Bill protected Penny's carrier with his body. The shot had been close, maybe a quarter-mile away, and it hadn't sounded like hunting. "That was a handgun," Tom said grimly, his law enforcement training evident in the way he assessed their tactical situation. "High caliber, probably a .45. Someone's either in trouble or making trouble." Penny had gone silent in her carrier, but her body language suggested fear rather than excitement. Whatever lay ahead, she didn't want to go there. But Emma's journal contained detailed maps of the area, and according to her notes, there was only one place in this canyon where someone could establish a permanent base camp. "The old mining operation," Bill said, pointing to a hand-drawn map in the journal's back pages. Emma marked it as dangerous, armed presence confirmed. If someone took her, that's where they'd go. Another gunshot, followed quickly by 2 more in rapid succession. This time there was no mistaking the sound of violence. Someone was either fighting for their life or executing prisoners, and Bill's military instincts told him they had minutes, not hours, to make a difference. "We need backup," Tom insisted, reaching for his radio. "This is beyond what 2 old men can handle, Bill. Let me call in the state police." "And tell them what? That we're trespassing on federal land following a pet raccoon to investigate a 20-month-old missing person case?" Bill was already moving toward the sound of gunfire, his pack secured and his hunting rifle ready. "By the time backup arrives, whatever's happening will be over." Tom cursed under his breath but followed, knowing that Bill was right. They were on their own in country that could kill them as easily as any human threat, following leads that no rational person would consider credible. But Emma's journal contained too many specific details to dismiss, and the evidence of violence at the campsite suggested that her investigations had indeed uncovered something worth killing for. The terrain grew more difficult as they climbed toward the old mining site, with loose shale and hidden crevices that could trap an unwary foot or turn an ankle. Penny had resumed her navigation duties, but her movements were more subdued now, as if she understood the danger they were approaching. "Look," Tom whispered, pointing to fresh tire tracks in a patch of muddy ground near a frozen creek. "All-terrain vehicles, at least 3 of them. Recent, within the last few days." The tracks led uphill toward what Emma's map identified as the entrance to the old copper mine. According to her notes, the operation had been abandoned in the 1970s when the ore played out, but the infrastructure remained: buildings, equipment, and most importantly, isolation from any form of outside surveillance. A scream echoed down from the mining site, high-pitched, desperate, and unmistakably human. It was followed by rough male voices and the sound of heavy machinery starting up. Whatever was happening up there, it was reaching a climax. Bill checked his rifle and looked at Tom with the kind of expression that had once made enemy soldiers reconsider their life choices. "I'm going up there. You can follow me, or try to stop me, but either way, I'm finding my granddaughter." Tom drew his service weapon and nodded grimly. "Marcus would never forgive me if I let his father die up here. Lead the way, old man." They began the final ascent toward the mining site, with Penny's soft chittering providing a counterpoint to their labored breathing. Behind them, the canyon stretched away toward civilization and safety. Ahead lay whatever truth Emma had died trying to uncover, and possibly Emma herself, if they weren't already too late. The sound of gunfire had stopped, but somehow that silence was more ominous than the violence that had preceded it. The old copper mine clung to the mountainside like a cancer, its rusted buildings and equipment casting long shadows in the afternoon sun. Bill and Tom approached from the east using abandoned mining equipment as cover while they assessed the situation. What they found was worse than either man had imagined. 3 all-terrain vehicles were parked near the main shaft entrance, their engines still warm. Armed men in military-style clothing moved between the buildings with the casual efficiency of people who'd done this before. But it was the sound coming from the largest structure, a corrugated metal building that had once housed mining equipment, that made Bill's blood run cold. Sobbing. A woman's voice, broken and desperate, pleading in words that didn't carry clearly across the distance but conveyed unmistakable terror. "Emma," Bill whispered, and started to rise from behind their cover before Tom's iron grip pulled him back down. "Wait," the sheriff hissed. "Count them first." "I see 4 men all armed with military-grade weapons. This isn't some random poaching operation, Bill. These guys are professionals." Through binoculars, they could see the operation more clearly. The men were systematically loading equipment into the vehicles. Computers, cameras, what looked like scientific instruments. Whatever they'd been doing here was finishing up, and they were preparing to eliminate the evidence, including witnesses. Penny had gone completely silent in her carrier, pressed against Bill's chest as if trying to disappear. Her dark eyes were fixed on the buildings below, and every line of her small body radiated fear. Whatever memories this place held for her, they weren't good ones. "We need a plan," Tom said, studying the tactical situation with 20 years of law enforcement experience. 4 armed men in defensive positions, unknown number of hostages, and terrain that gives them every advantage. "By any reasonable assessment, we should retreat and call for backup." "Reasonable went out the window when they took my granddaughter," Bill replied, checking his rifle with movements made automatic by decades of muscle memory. "I'm not leaving without her." "Then we do this smart. You take the high ground, use that hunting rifle to provide cover. I'll approach from the vehicle side. Try to get close enough to assess the hostage situation. When I give the signal..." Another scream from the building cut him off, followed by the sound of machinery starting up. Through the corrugated walls, they could see the glow of welding equipment and smell the acrid smoke of hot metal. "They're sealing something," Bill realized with growing horror. "Tom, they're not just eliminating witnesses, they're burying evidence, and Emma's in there." The next few minutes unfolded with the terrible clarity that combat veterans know too well. Time slowed, adrenaline sharpened focus to laser intensity, and the world reduced to targets, cover, and the simple imperative to survive while protecting what mattered most. Bill took position behind a rusted ore cart on the hillside above the mine, his rifle scope bringing the scene below into sharp focus. 2 men stood guard outside the main building while the other 2 worked inside, their shadows visible through grimy windows. The welding continued, and smoke began to seep from gaps in the building's walls. Tom moved like the combat veteran he'd once been, using abandoned equipment and natural cover to approach the vehicles. His plan was simple: disable their transportation, then create enough chaos to give Bill a clear shot at the guards. But plans, as Bill well knew from Vietnam, rarely survived first contact with the enemy. Penny suddenly erupted in frantic chittering, her tiny claws digging into Bill's jacket as she pointed toward the building. Through the scope, he could see why. Smoke was no longer just seeping from the walls, it was pouring out in thick, black clouds. Whatever they were burning inside was creating a toxic fog that would kill anyone trapped in the building within minutes. "Shit," Bill muttered, abandoning his position and starting down the slope toward the mine. Stealth was no longer an option. Emma would be dead from smoke inhalation long before they could execute any careful tactical plan. His movement triggered a chain reaction. One of the guards spotted him and shouted a warning, raising his automatic weapon toward the approaching figure. Tom, seeing Bill's cover blown, abandoned his own concealment and sprinted toward the vehicles, his service pistol drawn. The first shots came from the guards, muzzle flashes bright in the mountain air as they opened fire on Bill's position. He dove behind a pile of tailings, feeling bullets whine overhead with the familiar sound of death passing close. Penny's carrier pressed against his chest, and he could feel the small animal's heart hammering against his ribs in terrified rhythm. Tom reached the vehicles and began shooting out tires, the sharp cracks of his pistol providing counterpoint to the automatic weapons fire from the guards. But he was outnumbered and outgunned, pinned down between two ATVs while bullets sparked off metal around him. Bill had a clear shot at one of the guards, but taking it would reveal his position to the others. It was the kind of choice that defined soldiers: expose yourself to save a comrade or stay hidden and watch them die. For a man who'd lost his son to war and his wife to cancer, there was really no choice at all. His rifle spoke once, and the first guard dropped with the finality that high-velocity rounds delivered to the center mass. The second guard spun toward Bill's position, spraying automatic fire across the hillside in a pattern that spoke of training and experience. But training wasn't the same as desperation, and Bill had 3 lifetimes' worth of reasons to fight harder than he'd ever fought before. He worked the bolt action with mechanical precision, acquired his second target, and fired again. The guards stumbled but didn't fall. Body armor, probably military grade. That's when the welding equipment inside the building exploded. The blast shattered windows, sent metal debris flying in all directions, and turned the entire structure into a blazing inferno. Bill felt the heat wash over him even from his position on the hillside, and the smoke that poured from the wreckage was thick enough to choke on from 100 yards away. "Emma!" he screamed, abandoning all caution as he charged down the slope toward the burning building. Behind him, Penny's chittering had taken on an almost human quality of anguish, as if she understood exactly what the explosion meant. Tom emerged from behind the vehicles, his face grim as he surveyed the destruction. And the 2 guards outside were down, but the men who'd been working inside the building were nowhere to be seen. Either they'd escaped through a back exit, or they were trapped in the inferno along with their hostages. The heat was so intense that approaching the building was impossible. Paint blistered on metal surfaces, and the air itself seemed to shimmer with thermal distortion. If Emma had been inside when the explosion occurred, there was no way she could have survived. Bill sank to his knees in the snow, the rifle falling from nerveless fingers as the full magnitude of the disaster hit him. He'd arrived too late, fought too hard, and lost the last person in the world who mattered to him. The weight of failure pressed down on his shoulders like a physical thing, heavier than his pack, heavier than his grief, heavier than the accumulated mistakes of a lifetime. Penny suddenly struggled out of her carrier, her injured paw forgotten as she limped toward the burning building. Her chittering had taken on a new quality. Not anguish now, but something that sounded almost like calling. She was trying to get as close to the flames as possible, and her vocalization seemed directed at the building itself. "She's trying to tell us something," Tom said, kneeling beside Bill as they watched the small raccoon's increasingly frantic behavior. "Look at her. She's not mourning. She's searching." That's when they heard it. A faint tapping sound from somewhere beneath their feet. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short again. SOS in Morse code, coming from underground. "The mine shaft," Bill breathed, understanding flooding through him like cold water. "She's not in the building. She's in the mine itself." They found the entrance hidden behind a pile of debris that had been carefully arranged to look natural. The shaft descended at a steep angle into darkness, and the air that flowed up from below carried the scent of fear and human habitation. Bill grabbed his flashlight and started down into the earth, Tom close behind. Penny rode in her carrier again, but her chittering had become excited rather than distressed. She was leading them home, to wherever Emma had been hiding or imprisoned for the past 18 months. The tunnel branched multiple times, but Penny's guidance never wavered. Down they went, into the heart of the mountain, following a path that led either to salvation or to a tomb deep enough that their bodies would never be found. The tapping sound grew louder as they descended, and with it came something Bill hadn't dared hope for. The sound of a human voice, weak but alive, calling his name through the darkness. The mine shaft descended into darkness that seemed to swallow their flashlight beams whole. Bill moved with the careful urgency of a man who'd learned to navigate dangerous terrain in Vietnam, testing each step before committing his weight while Tom provided rear security. The air grew colder as they descended, carrying scents that spoke of long habitation, food, human waste, and the musty smell of fear that no amount of time could wash away. Penny's chittering had become a constant stream of communication, her vocalizations echoing off stone walls in patterns that almost sounded like language. She was guiding them through a maze of tunnels that branched in directions that defied logic, following routes that miners had carved through solid rock over a century ago. "Wait," Tom whispered, grabbing Bill's shoulder as they approached a junction where 3 tunnels converged. "Listen." The tapping had stopped, replaced by voices, human voices speaking in hushed, urgent tones. Bill strained to make out words, his heart hammering against his ribs as he recognized the cadence, if not the content. One voice was definitely female, young, with the kind of controlled desperation that came from someone who'd been fighting for survival for far too long. "Emma," he breathed, and started forward before Tom's grip tightened on his arm. "Careful," the sheriff warned. "We don't know who else might be down here. Could be guards, could be other prisoners. Let's not walk into an ambush." They moved forward with tactical caution, their flashlight beams dancing across tunnel walls that bore the pick marks of long-dead miners. The voices grew clearer as they approached, and Bill felt something inside his chest crack open when he finally heard words he could understand. "Can't give up now, Sarah. We've come too far, survived too much. My grandfather taught me that white horse women don't quit, and neither do the animals they care for, Emma." Alive, conscious, and talking to someone named Sarah. Bill had to bite down on his lip to keep from calling out immediately. Tom was right about the need for caution, but every instinct screamed at him to rush forward and grab his granddaughter before this nightmare could steal her away, too. The tunnel opened into a natural cavern that had been expanded by mining operations decades ago. Emergency LED lanterns provided dim illumination for what could only be described as an underground survival camp. Sleeping bags, medical supplies, food stores, and research equipment were organized with military precision around the stone chamber. But it was the occupants that made Bill's breath catch in his throat. Emma sat against the far wall, thinner than he remembered, but unmistakably alive. Her dark hair was longer, streaked with premature gray that spoke of stress and hardship, and her clothes were the practical layered garments of someone who'd learned to survive in harsh conditions. Beside her sat a woman Bill didn't recognize, mid-30s, Native American features, wearing the kind of outdoor gear that cost serious money. And between them, looking for all the world like she belonged there, was another raccoon. "Penny!" Emma cried out as the mother raccoon exploded from her carrier and limped across the cavern floor on 3 good legs. The reunion was immediate and joyful, with Penny chittering frantically while Emma gathered her into a fierce embrace that spoke of months of separation and worry. "Oh God, Penny, I thought they'd killed you when they took you for bait," Emma sobbed, her voice breaking with relief and exhaustion. "I've been so scared, so alone without you and the babies." That's when she looked up and saw Bill standing in the tunnel entrance, flashlight beam revealing a face she hadn't seen in 2 years. The silence that followed lasted exactly 3 heartbeats before Emma scrambled to her feet, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Grandpa?" Her voice was barely a whisper, as if speaking too loudly might shatter the apparition. How did you find me?" "Your friend here showed us the way," Bill said, gesturing to Penny while fighting to keep his own voice steady. "She brought her babies to the ranch, led us back to you. Smartest damn animal I ever met." The woman beside Emma stood up slowly, favoring her left leg in a way that suggested recent injury. "You're William Whitehorse," she said, extending her hand with formal politeness despite the circumstances. "Emma's told me a lot about you. I'm Dr. Sarah Moonhart, University of Montana Wildlife Biology Department." "You're supposed to be dead," Tom said bluntly, emerging from the tunnel with his weapon drawn but pointed at the floor. "Both of you. Emma's been missing for 18 months, and Dr. Moonhart was reported killed in a hiking accident last spring." Sarah's laugh was bitter, without humor. "Killed, yes. Accident, no. We've been prisoners down here for 8 months, ever since we discovered what they were really doing up top." She gestured toward a table covered with photographs, documents, and what looked like scientific equipment. "They've been using this mine as a base for poaching operations that span 3 states. Not just animals, but endangered plants, mineral specimens from protected lands, anything that can be sold to private collectors." Emma moved to the table, her movements careful and deliberate in the way of someone who'd learned that sudden motions could be dangerous. "We were documenting illegal hunting when they captured us. They kept us alive because they needed our research. Sarah's expertise in wildlife tracking and my knowledge of traditional Cherokee survival techniques. They've been forcing us to help them locate and capture rare animals," Sarah continued, her voice thick with self-disgust. "Threatened to kill the other if either of us refused. We've been living in hell, watching them destroy everything we've spent our careers trying to protect." Bill studied the evidence spread across the table. Photographs of dead animals, maps marked with hunting locations, financial records showing the sale of illegal specimens to buyers across the world. The scope of the operation was staggering, and the brutality was evident in every image. "How many of them?" Tom asked, his law enforcement training taking over as he assessed the tactical situation. "There were 6 originally," Emma replied, "but 2 left yesterday with a shipment headed for buyers in California. The 4 who stayed behind were supposed to—" She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence. "Supposed to clean up loose ends," Sarah finished grimly. "We heard the explosion up top. They were destroying evidence, eliminating witnesses. If you hadn't found us, we would have died down here," Emma said simply. They welded the main entrance shut and flooded the tunnels with carbon monoxide from their generators. This cavern has its own air supply from natural fissures, but it wouldn't have lasted long. Bill felt rage building in his chest, the kind of cold, controlled fury that had made him effective in combat, but dangerous in civilian life. These men had held his granddaughter prisoner for 8 months, forced her to help them destroy the natural world she'd dedicated her life to protecting, and then tried to murder her when she was no longer useful. "Where are they now?" he asked, his voice carrying undertones that made both women step back slightly. "Two are definitely dead from your shooting," Tom reported. "The other two either died in the explosion or escaped through the back tunnels. Either way, they're gone." "No," Emma said firmly, moving to another table covered with hand-drawn maps. "They're not gone. This whole mine connects to a natural cave system that extends for miles underground. They have emergency supplies cached throughout the network and alternate exits that lead to vehicle staging areas." She pointed to locations marked on her meticulously detailed maps. "They'll regroup, probably within hours, and when they do, they'll come back to make sure we're dead. They can't afford to leave witnesses alive. Too much money involved. Too many powerful people who bought their illegal specimens." Sarah nodded agreement, her expression grim. "We've seen their client list, Bill. Politicians, celebrities, foreign collectors who pay millions for endangered species. This isn't just some local poaching ring, it's an international criminal organization with resources and connections that reach into the highest levels of government." The weight of that revelation settled over the cavern like a physical presence. They weren't just dealing with criminals, they were facing an enemy with the power to make people disappear permanently, to cover up their crimes with official cooperation and unlimited funding. "Then we need to get out of here," Tom said, reaching for his radio. "Get back to civilization, contact federal authorities, and—" "No signal down here," Emma interrupted. "These rock formations block everything. And even if you could call for help, who would you trust? We've documented evidence that local officials have been paid off, that evidence from previous investigations has disappeared." Bill studied his granddaughter's face, seeing shadows there that spoke of knowledge no young woman should possess. 8 months of captivity had aged her in ways that had nothing to do with time, teaching her lessons about human cruelty that no university course could prepare her for. But she was alive, against all odds. Through months of hell that would have broken most people, Emma had survived. And more than survived, she'd continued fighting, gathering evidence, planning for the day when someone might come to rescue her. "What do you need from us?" he asked, simply. Emma's smile was fierce, carrying echoes of the Cherokee warriors who'd fought impossible odds to protect their people. "I need you to help us finish this. We have enough evidence to destroy their entire network, but only if we can get it to the right people. And that means getting out of these mountains alive." She moved to another cache of supplies, revealing communications equipment that looked military grade. "They've been monitoring law enforcement frequencies, staying one step ahead of any investigations. But Sarah's been working on something, a way to turn their own surveillance network against them. It's risky," Sarah warned, "but it's our only chance. We broadcast everything we've collected on emergency frequencies, send it to media outlets and federal agencies simultaneously, make it impossible for them to suppress or bury the evidence." Bill looked at Tom, seeing his own thoughts reflected in the sheriff's weathered face. They'd come to rescue one young woman and instead found themselves in the middle of something that could destroy careers, topple governments, and get them all killed if they made a single mistake. But Emma was family, and family was worth any risk. "Tell us what you need," he said. The emergency broadcast began at precisely 6:47 p.m. Mountain Time, flooding airwaves across 3 states with evidence that would bring down one of the largest wildlife trafficking operations in North American history. From their position in the natural cavern deep beneath the Montana mountains, Emma coordinated the transmission, while Sarah operated the communications equipment with the precision of someone who'd spent months planning this moment. FBI field offices in Denver, Salt Lake City, and Billings are receiving the primary data stream, Sarah reported. her fingers dancing across the keyboard of a ruggedized laptop connected to their improvised antenna array. Media outlets, including CNN, The Washington Post, and National Geographic, are getting the documentary evidence simultaneously. Bill stood watch at the cavern entrance, his rifle ready while Tom monitored their improvised early warning system, a network of motion sensors that Emma and Sarah had constructed from salvaged electronics during their months of captivity. The sensors covered all known approaches to their position, but both men knew their real protection lay in speed rather than firepower. "How long until the upload completes?" Bill asked, checking his watch against the timeline they'd established. Every minute they remained in the cavern increased the risk of discovery, but the evidence files were massive, months of documentation that couldn't be compressed without losing critical details. 23 minutes for full transmission, Emma replied, monitoring multiple data streams on her tablet. But the core evidence is already out there. Financial records, client lists, documentation of government corruption, enough to trigger federal investigations even if we don't make it out alive. The words hung in the mountain air like a promise and a threat. Bill understood what his granddaughter was really saying. They'd already accomplished their primary mission, but survival remained far from guaranteed. The men who'd orchestrated this operation had killed to protect their secrets, and they wouldn't hesitate to kill again. Penny chose that moment to emerge from the deeper recesses of the cavern, chittering softly as she approached Emma with something clutched in her tiny paws. It was a small electronic device, a GPS tracking unit that explained how their captors had always seemed to know their location despite the isolation of the underground complex. "Clever girl," Emma murmured, scratching behind Penny's ears with obvious affection. "You found their surveillance system?" No wonder they always stayed one step ahead of any rescue attempts. Sarah looked up from her equipment, understanding immediately. "They've been tracking us this entire time. Every movement, every attempt to escape, they knew exactly where we were." Her face paled as the implications hit her. "Which means they know we're here now." The motion sensors began chirping in rapid succession, indicating movement at multiple approach points around the mine complex. Through his binoculars, Bill could see vehicle lights winding up the mountain road. At least 3 sets, moving with the kind of tactical coordination that suggested military training. "They're coming," he announced grimly, checking his ammunition count. "Multiple vehicles, probably 8 to 10 men. We've got maybe 15 minutes before they reach the mine entrance." Tom was already moving, gathering their emergency packs while calculating escape routes through terrain that offered few options for concealment. "The back tunnels Emma mapped. How stable are they? Can we reach the secondary exit before they lock down the area?" "Maybe," Emma said, her attention divided between the ongoing data transmission and the tactical display on her tablet. "But there's a problem. The route passes through sections where the roof is unstable, mining damage from decades ago. Too much vibration or noise could trigger a collapse." "And if we stay here?" Bill asked, though he already knew the answer. "They'll flood the tunnels with tear gas, or worse," Sarah replied, disconnecting her equipment and preparing it for transport. "These men aren't interested in taking prisoners this time. They're here to eliminate witnesses permanently." The sound of heavy machinery echoed down from the surface, bulldozers or excavators being positioned to block potential escape routes. Their pursuers were approaching this like a military operation, using overwhelming force and careful planning to ensure no one left the mountain alive. Bill made the command decision that would define the next hour of their lives. "We run. Tom, take point with the GPS unit. Emma, you guide us through the unstable sections. You know this system better than anyone. Sarah, maintain the transmission as long as possible, then destroy the equipment if we're compromised." They moved out in tactical formation, following tunnels that had been carved through solid rock by miners who'd never imagined their work would one day provide escape routes for fugitives fleeing international criminals. The darkness beyond their flashlight beams seemed absolute, and the weight of millions of tons of stone above their heads was a constant psychological pressure. The first explosion came when they were halfway to the secondary exit, the shockwave traveling through the rock and causing dust to rain from the tunnel's ceiling. Their pursuers were using demolition charges to seal off potential escape routes, systematically eliminating options while driving their quarry toward whatever trap awaited at the end. "They're professionals," Tom observed grimly, studying the pattern of explosions on Emma's geological survey maps. "Military engineers, probably special forces contractors. They know exactly how to use this terrain against us." Emma paused at a junction where 3 tunnels converged, her flashlight beam revealing structural damage that spoke of recent cave-ins. "This is where it gets dangerous," she warned. "The next section has been compromised by water infiltration and mining subsidence. Any loud noise or vibration could bring down the entire ceiling." Behind them, they could hear voices echoing through the tunnel system. Their pursuers had entered the mine and were following their trail with the aid of tracking equipment and professional hunters who specialized in finding people who didn't want to be found. The voices were getting closer, and the tone suggested men who were confident in their eventual success. "How much farther?" Bill asked, feeling his age in every step as they navigated increasingly treacherous terrain. His knees protested against the constant climbing and descending, and his breathing was becoming labored in the thin air of the deep tunnels. "Quarter mile to the secondary exit," Emma replied, consulting her hand-drawn maps. "But there's another problem. The exit opens onto a cliff face with a 200-foot drop. It was designed as an emergency escape for miners, with a cable system that probably hasn't been maintained in 50 years. The sound of their pursuers was getting closer, echoing off stone walls in ways that made it impossible to determine exact distances or numbers. But the tone of the voices had changed, becoming more urgent and coordinated in ways that suggested they'd found the tracking device Emma had planted to mislead them about their actual route. "They're on to us," Sarah said, monitoring the enemy communications through equipment she'd liberated from their captors. "They know we're heading for the secondary exit, and they're sending teams to intercept us from multiple directions." Another explosion, much closer this time, caused visible cracks to appear in the tunnel walls around them. Chunks of rock fell from the ceiling, and the structural groaning that followed suggested they were approaching the limits of what the damaged mine could withstand. "They're trying to collapse the entire system," Emma realized with growing horror. "Bury the evidence along with the witnesses. They don't care if their own men get caught in the collapse. This is a scorched earth operation." Bill felt something shift inside his chest, the same cold clarity that had carried him through combat in Vietnam when the situation moved beyond tactics into pure survival. They weren't going to escape through careful planning or superior knowledge of the terrain. Their only chance lay in doing something so unexpected, so desperate, that their pursuers wouldn't be prepared for it. "New plan," he announced, stopping in a section of tunnel that showed evidence of recent water damage. "We don't run from the collapse, we cause it. Use their own demolition strategy against them." Tom understood immediately, his law enforcement experience recognizing the tactical shift from escape to counterattack. "Block the tunnel behind us, trap them in the unstable sections while we reach the exit. Risky, but it might work." "It's suicide," Sarah protested. "If we miscalculate the charges or the structural damage, we'll bring down the entire mountain. We could kill ourselves along with them." Emma studied her grandfather's face in the harsh beam of the flashlight, seeing something there that reminded her of the Cherokee warriors in the old stories. Men who'd chosen to fight impossible odds rather than surrender to an inevitable defeat. "What do you need?" she asked simply. Bill smiled, and for the first time in months, it reached his eyes. "I need you to trust an old soldier who's been preparing for this fight his entire life. And I need you to promise me something." "What?" Promise me that if this goes wrong, if we don't make it out, you'll find a way to finish what we started. The evidence is out there now, but someone needs to survive to testify to make sure these bastards pay for what they've done. Emma took his weathered hand in both of hers, feeling the calluses from decades of honest work and the slight tremor that spoke of age and accumulated injuries. We're all going to make it out, Grandpa. All of us. Together. The sound of approaching voices grew louder, and in the distance they could see the dancing beams of multiple flashlights searching the tunnels with methodical precision. Their pursuers were close now, close enough that conversation had to be conducted in whispers. Bill checked his rifle one final time and looked at each member of their small group, his granddaughter, his oldest friend, and a woman he'd met only hours ago but who'd already proven her courage under impossible circumstances. "Then let's go home," he said. Sometimes the greatest gifts come in the smallest packages, wrapped in fur and delivered by fate on the coldest night of your life. At 68, Bill Whitehorse thought he'd lost everything. His wife to cancer, his son to war, his granddaughter to pride and stubborn silence. Sitting alone in a house that echoed with memories, counting pills that promised an end to pain, he believed his story was over. But when a desperate raccoon mother arrived at his door with 3 dying babies, everything changed. What started as a simple act of mercy became a journey that would reunite a broken family, expose international criminals, and prove that love truly knows no boundaries. Bill discovered that sometimes we don't save the lost creatures that come to us. They save us. In opening his heart to a freezing raccoon family, he found his way back to the granddaughter he thought he'd lost forever, and learned that it's never too late for second chances, redemption, or the healing power of unconditional love. Have you ever had an unexpected encounter with an animal that changed your perspective on life? What family relationship would you risk everything to restore? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your stories of second chances and unexpected blessings. The mountain exploded. Bill's improvised demolition charges, constructed from mining equipment and explosives salvaged from their captors' supplies, brought down 300 feet of tunnel in a cascade of stone and timber that shook the earth for miles around. The sound was deafening, a rumble that started deep in the mountain's core and built to a crescendo that drowned out even the screams of the men caught in the collapse. In the seconds before the charges detonated, Bill had thrown himself over Emma and Penny, shielding them with his body while Tom and Sarah pressed against the reinforced section of tunnel wall that Emma had identified as their only possible shelter. The blast wave hit them like a physical blow, driving air from their lungs and filling the world with choking dust and the smell of shattered stone. When the rumbling finally stopped, they found themselves in complete darkness. Their flashlights had been scattered by the concussion, and the LED lanterns they'd been carrying were buried somewhere in the rubble that now filled the tunnel behind them. The silence that followed was absolute. No voices, no footsteps, no sound of pursuit. Either their enemies were dead, or they were trapped on the other side of millions of tons of rock. "Everyone alive?" Bill asked, his voice muffled by the dust-thick air. His ears were ringing from the explosion, and he could taste blood where he'd bitten his tongue during the blast. "Alive," Tom confirmed, his voice coming from somewhere to Bill's left. "Banged up, but functional. Sarah's unconscious, but breathing. Emma?" "I'm okay," came his granddaughter's shaky reply. "Penny's scared, but unhurt. Grandpa, that was either the bravest thing I've ever seen or the craziest." "Little of both," Bill admitted, feeling around in the darkness for their scattered equipment. His hands encountered smooth stone, loose rubble, and finally the reassuring weight of his rifle. "Question is, whether we just saved ourselves or buried ourselves alive." The search for their lights revealed the extent of their situation. They were in a pocket of relatively stable tunnel, perhaps 50 feet long, with solid rock walls on 3 sides and a pile of rubble blocking the way they'd come. Ahead, Emma's map suggested the tunnel continued toward the secondary exit, but there was no guarantee the passage remained clear or safe. "The air's still moving," Sarah observed as she regained consciousness, her voice thick with pain from what was probably a concussion. "That means there's still a way out, assuming we can reach it." Emma had recovered her tablet and was studying their position relative to the mine's exit points. "We're about 400 yards from the secondary exit, but there's a problem. The cable system I mentioned, it's the only way down from the cliff face, and we don't know if it's still functional after 50 years of weather and neglect." "Cross that bridge when we come to it," Bill said, shouldering his pack with movements that reminded him of every one of his 68 years. "Right now, our choice is simple: move forward or wait here to die." They formed up in single file, with Emma taking point, using her intimate knowledge of the tunnel system to navigate obstacles and hazards that would have stopped anyone else. The passage grew narrower as they advanced, forcing them to crawl through sections where the ceiling had sagged under the weight of accumulated damage. Penny rode in her carrier against Bill's chest, her small body providing unexpected comfort in the claustrophobic darkness. Occasionally she would chitter softly, as if offering encouragement, and Bill found himself talking to her in the same low, steady voice he'd once used to calm frightened horses. "Almost there, girl," he murmured as they squeezed through a particularly tight section. "Just a little farther, and we'll all be back in the sunshine." The tunnel began to slope upward, and fresher air carried the scents of pine trees and snow. Somewhere ahead lay the outside world, civilization, safety, and the chance to ensure that their evidence reached the right people. But between them and freedom lay whatever challenges awaited at the exit point. They saw daylight before they reached it, a pale glow filtering down from above that grew stronger with each step. The tunnel ended at a natural chamber carved from solid rock, with a shaft extending upward toward what had once been an emergency exit for trapped miners. Ancient wooden beams supported a cable system that disappeared into the shaft above, and rusty equipment suggested this had been a functional escape route decades ago. 200 feet straight up," Emma said, studying the cable system with professional assessment. "The cables look intact, but there's no way to test them without putting weight on the system." Tom examined the mechanical components with the eye of someone who'd maintained equipment under field conditions. "The pulleys are seized with rust, but the main cables appear sound. We might be able to rig a manual climbing system using our rope and carabiners." "Might being the operative word," Sarah added grimly. "If those cables fail while we're climbing, it's a 200-foot fall onto solid rock. Not exactly survivable at our age." Bill looked at each member of their group, weighing risks against alternatives that didn't exist. Behind them lay collapsed tunnels and probable death. Above them lay uncertain cables and possible death. The choice was mathematical in its simplicity. "I'll go first," he announced, checking his climbing gear with movements made automatic by decades of practice. "Test the system with the lightest load, just me and Penny. If it holds, we'll rig a proper belay system for the rest of you." "Absolutely not," Emma protested. "You're 68 years old. You've been through hell in the last 24 hours, and you're carrying an injured animal." "If anyone's testing those cables, it should be me." "Like hell," Bill replied, with the kind of finality that had once made enemy soldiers reconsider their life choices. "I didn't survive Vietnam, raise a son, and lose a wife just to watch my granddaughter fall to her death in a mine shaft. I'm going first, and that's the end of the discussion." The argument that followed was brief but intense, conducted in hushed voices that wouldn't carry to any potential listeners above. Emma's logic was sound. She was younger, stronger, and more experienced with technical climbing. But Bill's authority was absolute. He was the senior member of their group, And in situations like this, someone had to make command decisions that others might not like. The compromise they reached satisfied no one but reflected the reality of their situation. Bill would make the initial climb to test the cable system, but he would carry emergency rappelling gear that would allow him to descend quickly if the equipment failed. Emma would follow immediately behind, ready to assist if problems developed. The first 50 feet went smoothly, with the old mining cables creaking ominously, but holding their weight. Penny remained calm in her carrier, as if she understood that any sudden movement could prove fatal for both of them. The shaft walls were smooth stone, offering no handholds or alternative routes if the cable system failed. At the 100-foot mark, one of the support cables snapped. The sound was sharp and final, the crack of metal under stress reaching its breaking point. Bill swung sideways, slamming into the shaft wall with an impact that drove air from his lungs and sent sparks of pain through his arthritic joints. For a terrifying moment, he hung suspended on the remaining cables while debris from the broken support system rained down toward his companions below. "I'm okay," he called down, though his voice carried more confidence than he felt. "One cable failed, but the main system is holding. Keep coming up, but test each connection before you trust it." The remaining climb was a nightmare of caution and controlled fear. Each movement had to be calculated, each handhold tested, each step verified before committing weight to equipment that had been deteriorating for half a century. By the time they reached the surface, all 4 climbers were exhausted and running on adrenaline alone. They emerged into late afternoon sunshine that felt like a gift from heaven after the darkness of the underground tunnels. The exit point was exactly as Emma had described, a narrow ledge on a cliff face that overlooked a valley stretching for miles toward the distant lights of civilization. The view was spectacular and terrifying, with a sheer drop that would kill anyone who lost their footing, but they were alive. Against all odds, through explosions and cave-ins and a climb that should have killed them all, they had reached the surface with their evidence intact and their lives preserved. Bill sank to his knees on the rocky ledge, feeling sunshine on his face for the first time in what seemed like years. "We did it," Emma said, her voice filled with wonder and exhaustion. "We actually did it. We got out alive." Penny emerged from her carrier and immediately began exploring their new surroundings, chittering with what sounded like relief and excitement. Her injured paw was healing well, and her natural curiosity had returned with their escape from the underground prison. "Now what?" Tom asked, studying the valley below and calculating distances to potential rescue points. "We're alive, but we're stranded on a cliff face in the middle of nowhere with no way to get down and no way to signal for help." Sarah was already setting up their emergency communications equipment, using the elevated position to boost their signal strength. The evidence upload completed successfully. Federal agencies and media outlets across the country have received everything we documented, but we still need to survive long enough to testify. That's when they heard the helicopters. 3 aircraft approached from the south, flying in formation with the kind of precision that suggested military or law enforcement operation. Bill felt his heart sink as he recognized the implications. Their pursuers had survived the tunnel collapse and called in additional resources to complete their mission. "They're not giving up," he said grimly, checking his rifle and calculating fields of fire from their exposed position. "We hurt them, but we didn't stop them. Now they're coming with everything they've got." Emma was studying the approaching aircraft through binoculars, her expression shifting from fear to confusion to something that might have been hope. "Wait," she said slowly. "Those aren't private helicopters. Look at the markings: FBI, U.S., Marshal Service, and what looks like military special operations." The lead helicopter circled their position once before setting down on a wider section of the cliff face about a quarter-mile away. Armed figures in tactical gear emerged, but their movements suggested rescue rather than assault. Through her binoculars, Emma could see familiar faces, federal agents she'd worked with during her research, people who knew her reputation and would believe her evidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," Tom said with the first genuine smile any of them had worn in days, "I believe our cavalry has arrived." The rescue that followed was swift and professional, conducted by federal agents who'd received their evidence uploads and immediately understood the scope of what they'd uncovered. Bill found himself wrapped in emergency blankets and loaded into a helicopter that would carry him back to civilization, safety, and the chance to ensure that the men who'd nearly killed his family would face justice. As the aircraft lifted off from the mountain cliff, Bill looked down at the mine complex where they'd nearly died. Smoke still rose from the collapsed tunnels, and the burned remains of the surface buildings looked like scars on the pristine landscape. But they had survived, and more importantly, they had won. Emma sat beside him, Penny curled in her lap like a furry guardian angel who'd guided them all home. The raccoon looked perfectly content, as if she'd always known this rescue would come, as if she'd planned the entire operation from the moment she'd led her babies through a blizzard to find the grandfather who could save them all. "Think she knew?" Bill asked, scratching behind Penny's ears with gentle fingers. "Think she somehow understood that bringing her kits to me would set all this in motion?" Emma smiled, the first completely happy expression he'd seen on her face since Marcus's funeral 2 years ago. "I think she's smarter than all of us combined. And I think she knows exactly what family means, even when that family includes different species." Through the helicopter's windows, Bill could see the lights of Billings approaching in the distance. Home, safety. The chance to rebuild relationships that pride and pain had nearly destroyed forever. He thought of Hope and the other raccoon kits waiting at Ruth's house, probably wondering when their mother would return. Tomorrow there would be federal investigations, media interviews, and the long process of bringing international criminals to justice. There would be medical examinations, psychological counseling, and the difficult work of healing from trauma that had lasted far too long. But tonight, there would be family, a grandfather and granddaughter who'd found each other again through the courage of a small animal with an enormous heart. A raccoon mother who'd risked everything to save her babies and ended up saving the humans who'd tried to help her. As the helicopter descended toward the lights of civilization, Bill Whitehorse understood that some gifts come in the smallest packages, and the greatest love often arrives when we least expect it and most desperately need it. The story that had begun with despair and contemplated suicide was ending with hope, healing, and the unbreakable bonds that make families something worth fighting for.